The first time I saw her, the sun had barely cleared the ridge, throwing a long gold shadow across the dirt track that wound to my gate. She came on foot, boots, dusted pale hair tied back against the morning wind. Each step looked measured, like she might turn around at any moment. I'd had no visitor in years, yet there she was, stopping at the fence rail, as if testing its strength before trusting her weight to it. Her eyes met mine across the yard, and for a moment neither of us spoke. She was a stranger, but something in her gaze said she'd come too far to be turned away without asking what she needed. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had someone appear at your door when you least expected it, asking for something that might change you both. My name's Silas Ward, and for most of my life, I've kept to myself on a spread of land, a day's ride from the nearest depot. I was raised in a cabin where work came before talk, where you learned early that a fence line didn't mend itself, and winter stores didn't appear without long summer days in the field. My folks believed in keeping your word, bowing your head on Sundays, and lending a hand to a neighbor, whether you liked him or not. That kind of living doesn't make a man rich in coin, but it keeps his name clean, and back then, that was worth more than any banknote. Out here, you measure wealth in head of cattle in the feel of rain after a dry spell in a roof that doesn't leak when the wind comes hard from the north. My world had always been one of quiet seasons and steady work until the day it wasn't. The railroad brought more than freight and travelers. It brought men with fine coats and hard eyes, the kind who saw land as lines on a ledger. I learned quick that a handshake didn't mean the same to them as it did to my father. A man could lose more than his grazing pasture if he wasn't watching close. He could lose the life he'd built, the trust he'd kept. After Sarah died, I let the rest of it slip away, piece by piece. The stock dwindled, the barn leaned, and I stopped answering when someone knocked. Years passed with nothing but my own company and the work I could still manage alone. Then that morning, Clarabelle Hensley showed up at my fence line, saying she'd walked 12 miles from town. She said she heard I kept milk cows and wanted work. I could see the road dust on her hem, the way her hands gripped the rail like she meant to hold her ground, no matter what I said. I didn't know it then, but her arrival was the first shift in a life I thought I'd finished shaping. She stood there waiting for an answer while the breeze carried the scent of the alfalfa field and the distant sound of a church bell in town. I kept my voice even when I asked her why she'd come all that way. She drew in a breath, about to answer, and that's when I saw the shadow of a rider coming slow along the road behind her. The rider came slow along the road, his horse's hooves sending up little puffs of dust in the still air. Clarabelle glanced back over her shoulder, then returned her eyes to mine, standing her ground. The man in the saddle wore a brown duster and a felt hat, pulled low, face mostly hidden in the shade of the brim. He passed without a word, the faint jingle of his tack fading down the trail toward town. Only when the sound was gone did Clarabelle speak, her voice steady, but carrying a weight that made me lean closer to hear. She told me her father had been a blacksmith until sickness hollowed his lungs and left him too weak to swing a hammer. Her mother kept house for the younger children, but there was never enough coin for both food and medicine. Clarabelle had been doing small chores in town for neighbors who could spare a dime, yet it was never enough to cover what they needed. She'd heard I kept dairy cows and thought maybe I could use an extra pair of hands. I shook my head at first, telling her I managed just fine. Her gaze didn't waver. She asked if she could at least see the cattle, saying she knew the signs of good milk stock and might be able to give advice. There was no pleading in her tone, just a plain statement of skill. Against my better judgment, I unlatched the gate and led her toward the barn. We walked a few paces apart, my boots crunching over dry earth, her steps lighter but sure. Inside the barn, the warm air carried the smell of hay and livestock. Clarabelle moved straight to the nearest cow, laying a hand on its flank, speaking low enough I couldn't catch the words. The animal stilled almost at once, tail flicking in slow rhythm. She bent to check the udder, her fingers gentle but certain, and then glanced toward me with a nod that said she'd found what she expected. She moved from one stall to the next, pausing now and then to stroke a muzzle or scratch behind an ear. The cows leaned toward her touch, the tension easing from their shoulders. It was plain she had the knack. When she stopped, she told me one was showing signs of early trouble, nothing that couldn't be mended if caught now but left alone. It could cut into the milk come winter. Her voice was matter-of-fact, not critical. I asked how she knew so much about dairying, and she told me her mother's folks had kept milk cows on a small homestead back east. She'd learned from them before the family came west, and later helped a neighbor in exchange for butter and cream. Her eyes met mine again, waiting for a decision. Clarabelle then made her offer plain. She'd work for a week without pay just to prove herself. If I wasn't satisfied, she'd walk away without complaint. I studied her face in the dim light filtering through the barn boards. She was young, but there was a set to her jaw that didn't belong to youth alone. I agreed, though I told myself it was for the good of the stock, nothing more. Relief softened her expression, and for the first time I caught the hint of a smile. We talked through the work morning and evening, milking feed schedules, keeping the stalls clean. She'd come at dawn and be done before the sun was high, then return before dusk. That first morning went smooth enough. Clarabelle arrived as the sky was still pink at the edges, carrying a small basket she left by the barn door. She worked without fuss, humming now and then, the cows settling under her hands like they'd known her for years. I kept to mending a section of fence close enough to see her, but far enough not to be in her way. When she finished, she cleaned the buckets and tools before setting them back in their place. I stepped inside, then meaning to say a word about her work. She looked up, her eyes bright in the dim barn, and said the herd would be healthier in a week with steady care. I found myself asking if she'd eaten, though the question surprised me as much as it did her. She admitted she hadn't, having left home before first light. I told her to wait and went to the cabin, putting on coffee and setting out the biscuits I'd baked the night before. She sat at the rough table, folding her hands, while her eyes took in the room: one chair, a narrow bed against the far wall, a shelf of worn crockery. We spoke little while she ate, but now and again her gaze would meet mine before dropping back to her cup. When she left that afternoon, the path behind her seemed longer than it had that morning. The yard felt quieter, the air still. I told myself it was just the end of a workday. Yet I found my eyes drifting toward the ridge, measuring how long before I saw her figure again. The next day, she was back at dawn. We fell into a rhythm, her with the cows, me with whatever needed doing on the place. Now and then, she'd ask a question about the land or the herd, never prying beyond what was useful for the job. In the evenings, she'd head home as the sun slipped behind the ridge, the light turning the dust in her wake to gold. Late on the third day, clouds built high over the mountains, darkening fast. The wind shifted, carrying the sharp scent of rain. Clarabelle came up the path with her hair loose around her face, her pace quick but steady. She set to work at once, calming the cattle as the air grew heavy. I stood in the barn doorway, watching the sky break open in a sudden downpour. By the time the milking was done, rain was sweeping sideways, drumming against the roof. I told her it was too dangerous to walk the 12 miles home in that weather. She hesitated, saying her family would be expecting her. But a clap of thunder shook the ground under our feet, and she agreed to wait until the worst had passed. She chose to bed down in the barn rather than my cabin, spreading a blanket on the hay in the corner. I fetched her a lantern and left her there, the light spilling over the boards while the storm raged outside. In the quiet between thunder, I could hear her moving about, tending to the cows, speaking in that same low voice. When I finally stepped back into the cabin, I felt the change, though I couldn't yet name it. Something in the order I'd kept for 20 years was shifting, and with it came a sense that the days ahead might not be as quiet as the ones behind. The rain kept on through most of the night, drumming steady against the barn roof. I woke more than once to the low murmur of Clarabelle's voice speaking to the cattle as she checked them in the lantern light. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean, the ground soft underfoot. I stepped out into the yard to find her already at work, skirts gathered above her boots, hands moving with practiced ease. She greeted me with a small nod, as though nothing about bedding down in a stranger's barn during a lightning storm needed remark. When the milking was done, she brought the buckets to the table by the door, her cheeks pink from the cool air. I told her she could take her time heading home, let the mud firm up before making the walk. She shook her head, saying her mother would be counting on her to help with the little ones, but she paused long enough to say she was grateful for the shelter. Her eyes held mine a moment longer than before, and in that look was a quiet understanding. I asked her how she'd learned to keep such a steady hand around livestock. And she spoke of her mother's parents again, how they'd raised her to tend animals like they were part of the family. Then, without warning, she turned the talk to me. She said she could see I'd been around cattle my whole life, but that there was something in my way of holding back, not just with people, but with the animals too. I didn't answer. She didn't press. The week we'd agreed on was halfway through when I realized I'd stopped thinking of her as a visitor. She moved through the chores as if she'd always been there, humming while she worked, finding small ways to make things easier without being told. More than once, I caught her studying a broken hinge or a leaning post, and the next day I'd see it set right before I'd even started toward it. On the fifth morning, a pale frost silvered the pasture grass. Clarabelle arrived early, the cold turning her breath to white clouds. As we worked, she spoke about her father's worsening cough, how the medicine the doctor prescribed was near gone. Her voice stayed steady, but I could hear the wear in it. I asked her what she planned to do when the week was up, and she said simply that she'd keep looking for work, though there wasn't much to be had in town this time of year. That evening, I walked out to the pasture after she'd gone. The sun was low, painting the ridge in orange light. The quiet should have felt familiar, but it didn't. The yard seemed emptier now when she wasn't there, the cattle restless without her voice. I went back inside and found myself staring at the coffee pot, thinking about offering her more than a week's work. The next morning, I did just that. I told her she could stay on with proper wages if she wanted. She stood there a moment, hands still on the milking stool, and I saw the change in her expression, part relief, part something heavier. She said yes, but her voice caught just enough to let me know what it meant. From then on, we worked side by side more often. She still kept her talk spare, but now and again she'd share a piece of her life at home. How her youngest brother had taken to following her around the yard, how her mother had started rising before dawn to stretch the day longer. I listened, answering only when needed, but I found the telling mattered more than the words. One afternoon near the end of the week, a dust cloud showed on the road from town. A rider came into view, the same one I'd seen that first morning. He slowed as he passed the gate eyes, sweeping the yard before settling on the barn. Clarabelle froze where she stood, her shoulders going tight. The man touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that felt more like a claim than a greeting, then rode on without a word. She went back to work after he was gone, but her quiet was different, closer to guarded than reserved. I didn't ask about him. Still, as I watched her walk down the path that evening, I had the sense that whatever brought her to my gate wasn't just hunger for wages. The following day dawned still and cold, the kind of morning where every sound carries. I was in the yard splitting wood when I heard boots on the road. When I looked up, Clarabelle was coming toward me with a letter in her hand. Clarabelle stopped at the woodpile, letter in hand, her breath showing in the chill morning air. She said it had come by way of a neighbor headed toward town. The paper was creased, the ink a little blurred where damp had touched it. She didn't offer it right off, but looked toward the barn, asking if we could talk there. Inside, the light was soft through the slats, the cows shifting lazily in their stalls. She told me the letter was from her mother, written in a hurry. Thomas's breathing had worsened over the last 2 nights, and the doctor had been clear the medicine needed replenishing immediately. There was no money left in the house to pay for it, and her mother feared the apothecary wouldn't extend more credit. Clarabelle's voice stayed steady, but her fingers worried the folded paper, as though holding it tighter might keep the words from carrying more weight. I asked if she planned to go back to town that morning. She nodded, saying she could be there and back before nightfall if the weather held. I could see she'd already worked out the route in her head. I told her she might find the road soft from last week's rain, and she only answered that she'd managed worse. The cows needed seeing to before she left, so she set to work without further talk. We finished the chores in near silence. When she left for town, the letter was tucked safe in her apron, her stride quick against the wind coming down from the ridge. I kept at my own work, but more than once I caught myself looking toward the road. The day passed slower than most, the light thinning sooner than I liked. It was near dusk when I heard boots on the porch. Clarabelle stepped inside, hair loosened from the walk, cheeks flushed with cold. She set a small paper sack on the table and said she'd gotten the medicine, but not without trouble. The apothecary had been reluctant until she promised to settle the bill within the week. She'd also caught sight of the rider from before, posted near the livery as if waiting. He hadn't spoken to her, but his eyes had followed until she turned the corner. I didn't ask for his name. She didn't offer it. Instead, she said she'd best get home before full dark. I offered her the lantern, and she accepted it without protest, the glow stretching her shadow across the yard as she walked away. The next morning came colder, a thin crust of ice over the water trough. Clarabelle was late, which wasn't her way. I had nearly decided to start the milking alone when she appeared at the gate carrying herself a bit slower than usual. She said her father had been restless through the night, coughing hard enough to bring blood to his lips. Her mother had asked her to stay home, but Clarabelle had insisted on coming, saying she couldn't risk the herd falling behind in care. Through the day, she worked with a quiet that was heavier than her usual reserve. I caught her more than once pausing with her hand on a cow's shoulder, her gaze somewhere far off. When we finished, I told her she might take the next day to tend to her family. She hesitated, then agreed, saying she'd be back the day after. That evening, I sat by the stove, the wind rattling the loose board above the window. The yard felt too still, the night pressing in. I thought about the look she'd worn all day, about the way she'd kept her voice low, as if speaking louder might let something slip she wasn't ready to share. When dawn came, I worked alone. The barn was colder without her lantern on the hook, the cows restless at the change. By midday, I decided to ride toward town, though I told myself it was only to collect supplies. The road was rutted and half frozen, the sky heavy with the promise of snow. As I came into the edge of town, I saw Clarabelle leaving the mercantile with a bundle in her arms. She spotted me and stopped short, the bundle shifting as she adjusted her grip. She said her father was no better, and her mother had sent her for flour and beans to stretch the winter stores. Behind her, further down the street, that same rider stood near the post office, watching. Clarabelle glanced his way once, then back to me. She said she'd explain when she brought the next milk delivery into town. I told her I'd see her safe to her door. She didn't argue. The road back was quiet except for the creak of the saddle and the steady breath of the horses. At the Hensley place, Martha came out to meet us, her face-drawn eyes shadowed with lack of sleep. She thanked me for the escort, and I told her I'd check in again soon. Clarabelle didn't linger at the fence this time. She only said I should be careful riding back before nightfall. The sky was paling toward the first touch of snow when I reached my own gate. In the stillness, I thought I heard hoofbeats far behind me. But when I turned, the road was empty. 2 days passed without seeing Clarabelle. The chores were heavier alone, the barn quieter in a way that made each creak of the rafters sound louder. On the third morning, I found her at the gate before sunup, bundled against the cold, her face pale but set with resolve. She said her father's fever had broken for now, though the coughing hadn't eased. The medicine had bought him a little more time, but not enough to put the family at ease. We worked through the morning in near silence, the frost still crisp under our boots. When the last bucket was carried in, she lingered by the stall, her hand on the neck of the oldest cow. Then she said she needed to ask a favor, not for her but for her family. The flour and beans from the mercantile would last another week at most, and with her father unable to work, she had no way to earn more coin except by taking on extra hours here. I told her there was always more to be done, but she shook her head slightly, saying she'd need pay in advance if I could spare it. I studied her face for a moment, then agreed, knowing full well she'd put it straight toward her household. She thanked me quietly, then set back to work with a little more speed in her step. That afternoon I was mending fence along the north pasture when I saw the rider again. He came at an angle from the far ridge, slow and steady, not making for the main road. By the time he reached the lower trail, Clarabelle was already halfway home, walking fast with her head down. The man didn't overtake her, but he kept to the same pace until the bend in the road hid them from view. The next morning she arrived later than usual, her hair wind-blown, eyes red from lack of sleep. She admitted she'd taken the long way around to avoid passing near the livery. When I asked why she hesitated, then said the rider was someone from her past who hadn't taken kindly to her refusal of a courtship a year back. He'd left town after her father fell ill, but returned in recent weeks, making his presence known without saying a word. I told her plainly that she could come and go by my west trail if she wished it added a mile, but it kept clear of the main road. She agreed, though I could see the weight of it still on her shoulders. The rest of the day passed in a rhythm that was careful but less strained than the morning. Toward evening, as she gathered her shawl, I said I'd walk her part way. The air was sharp, the last light stretching long across the pasture. We reached the ridge before she spoke again, saying her father had been a proud man, never asking for help until the sickness forced it. She didn't want pity for her family, only the chance to keep them fed and warm until spring. I told her she had that here for as long as she needed. When we parted, I watched her lantern bob down the west trail until it disappeared behind the rise. I turned for home, the cold deepening with every step. Near the barn, the horses shifted uneasily, ears pricked toward the road. I listened, and in the stillness, there it was again, the distant, steady beat of hooves coming closer. The hoofbeats drew nearer until I could make out the rider's silhouette against the pale evening sky. He slowed when he reached the gate, his horse sidestepping once before settling. From the saddle, he tipped his hat in a manner that was more measured than friendly, then asked if Clarabelle was on the place. I told him she was not, and his eyes narrowed just enough to make the quiet between us stretch. He said his name was Boyd Maddox and that he'd be seeing her soon. Then he turned his horse without another word, riding off toward the west trail. I finished the evening chores with the last of the light, my thoughts on the way. Clarabelle had stiffened each time the rider's shadow passed close in town. The wind had picked up by the time I latched the barn, carrying the first dry scent of snow from the ridge. I left the lantern burning in the kitchen, though I kept glancing toward the road until full dark settled in. Clarabelle came early the next morning, the air so cold, her breath hung in front of her. She noticed I was already in the yard and asked if something had happened. I told her Maddox had stopped by the gate the night before. She set her pail down slowly, her jaw tightening, then said nothing for several beats. When she did speak, it was to say he had courted her for a time back before her father took ill. His manner had soured when she refused his proposal. And when the sickness came to their household, he'd used it as reason to say she was beneath him. We went about the milking in a quiet that was heavy, but not strained. Now and then she'd glance toward the pasture as if measuring how far a man on horseback could close the distance. When we finished, I told her she was welcome to stay on the ranch if the road home ever felt unsafe. She nodded, though I could tell she wasn't ready to accept the offer. By midday, snow had begun to fall in slow, drifting flakes. I was working in the barn when Clarabelle came to the door with a look that told me before she spoke Maddox had been seen in town that morning asking after her. She said her mother had sent word through a neighbor warning her to keep to the west trail for a time. We spent the afternoon repairing a section of fence near the lower pasture. The snow came thicker, muting the sound of our boots on the frozen ground. Clarabelle worked with her usual steady hand, but she kept her scarf high, the wool pulled close against her cheeks. When the fence was righted, she gathered her things, saying she'd head home before the light faded completely. I watched her lantern glow fade down the trail, the snow swallowing the sound of her steps. That night, the wind came hard, rattling the eaves. I set another log on the fire and tried to read, but my attention kept drifting to the quiet outside. Just before I turned in, I thought I heard a horse pass on the road, moving slow, the rider not calling out. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving only a thin crust over the drifts. Tracks cut across the road near the gate, fresh, with the edges still sharp. Clarabelle arrived later than usual, saying the snow had made the walk slower. I told her about the tracks, and her eyes flicked toward the road before she busied herself with the milking. We worked in silence for a while, the warm smell of the barn a comfort against the cold. When we were done, she stayed by the door, gloved hands resting on the latch. She said Maddox had once been a man she could speak plain with, but she didn't trust his intentions now. Before she left that day, I told her my offer still stood, that she could stay on the ranch if she chose. She gave a small nod, saying she'd think on it, then stepped into the cold. I watched her cross the yard, the snow crunching under her boots, her figure growing smaller as the pale winter light began to fade. That evening, I lit the lanterns early. Outside, the ridge was already in shadow when a single rider appeared against the snow, moving at a steady walk toward the gate. The rider's shape grew clearer as he came down the road, snow crunching under his horse's hooves. Boyd Maddox drew up at the gate, his gloved hands resting loose on the reins. He didn't ask permission to enter, only leaned forward in the saddle and said he'd heard Clarabelle was working here. I told him that was her business, not mine. His mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile, and he said a man had a right to speak with a woman who'd once agreed to keep company with him. I didn't answer that. Instead, I stepped forward and put my hand on the gatepost. Maddox watched me for a beat longer, then pulled his horse around. Before he left, he said the winter was long and people's minds could change. His meaning hung in the air even after he rode off toward the ridge. The next morning, Clarabelle came early, her cheeks raw from the wind. She saw my face before I spoke and asked if Maddox had been by again. I told her he had. She drew in a long breath, then let it out slow. She said she'd rather avoid crossing paths with him entirely, but didn't think that was likely now. We worked without much talk after that, though she kept glancing toward the road whenever the wind shifted. Midday brought a knock at the cabin door. It was Martha Hensley, her shawl dusted with snow. She'd walked from town to tell me Maddox had been lingering near their place 2 nights running and that Thomas was too weak to stand watch. She asked if Clarabelle could remain on the ranch for a while, at least until Maddox's interest cooled. I told her she could, and Martha's shoulders eased some, though her eyes stayed wary. When Clarabelle returned from the pasture that afternoon, I told her of her mother's visit. She stood still for a moment, then nodded. She said she'd fetch her things the next day. That evening we worked side by side in the barn, the sound of cattle shifting in the stalls filling the spaces between us. The snow came heavier overnight. By morning the drifts were knee-high in places. Clarabelle arrived with a small bundle and set it just inside the cabin door before heading straight for the barn. We kept the routine as normal as we could, though I noticed how she stayed closer to the buildings, avoiding the open stretches where a rider could spot her easily. That night, I made up a bed for her in the small room off the kitchen. She thanked me in a low voice and closed the door. I sat by the stove a while longer, listening to the wind against the eaves. Somewhere out there, a horse snorted the sound, carrying faint over the snow. The next day passed without sign of Maddox. We mended a section of the barn roof where the snow had weighed it down, our gloves stiff with cold. Clarabelle worked steadily, her eyes on the task. Near sundown, I spotted movement on the far ridge. A lone rider sat there, just still enough to be watching. When I looked again, the ridge was empty. That evening, as I banked the fire, Clarabelle said she wouldn't let Maddox drive her from honest work. She'd come here for wages and to help her family, and she meant to see it through. I told her she had my word she could stay as long as she needed. She nodded once, and we left it at that. Outside, the snow kept falling, the night deep and quiet. Somewhere beyond the ridge, I had the feeling Maddox was waiting, and that the time for avoiding him was running short. Boyd Maddox reached the gate just after sundown, the last light fading behind the ridge. I stepped out onto the porch, lantern in hand. He reined up close enough for the horse's breath to rise in the cold between us. He said Clarabelle should come with him now, his tone making it sound less like an invitation and more like an order. I told him she wouldn't be going anywhere she didn't choose to. Clarabelle came to stand beside me, her shawl drawn tight, eyes fixed on Maddox. She told him plain she'd made her decision long ago, and it hadn't changed. He leaned in the saddle, studying her for a moment, then let out a short, humorless laugh. Said she'd regret it. I took a step forward, my hand resting on the gatepost. Maddox held my gaze, but when he saw I wasn't moving aside, he jerked the reins and turned back toward the road. We watched until his shape was swallowed by the dark. Clarabelle's shoulders eased, but I could still see the tremor in her hands. I told her she was welcome to stay here for as long as she wanted, and this time she didn't hesitate before agreeing. Over the next week, the snow deepened the days, quiet but steady. Word came through the telegraph office that Maddox had taken work driving cattle south. Whether it was true or not, we didn't see him again. Clarabelle began walking into town, with the milk deliveries no longer avoiding the main road. Her mother would meet her at the mercantile, and now and then I'd ride in to help carry the heavier loads back. Thomas's health didn't improve much, but the medicine kept him comfortable through the worst of the winter. Clarabelle split her time between the ranch and her family's home, always back before the evening milking. The herd thrived under her care, calmer, stronger, the way livestock get when handled with patience. By spring, the pasture was green again, and the ice in the troughs was only a memory. Clarabelle came to me one morning saying her family was getting by, and she wanted to keep working here through the summer. I told her I'd be glad of it. There was no ceremony in the words, but they carried the weight of something settled. Looking back, I realized that what began as a week's trial had turned into something neither of us had planned, a place where trust had a chance to grow again. On the frontier, you don't get to choose every hardship that comes, but you can choose who stands beside you when it does. Clarabelle had come here asking for work. She'd stayed because both of us found more than we expected. If you've ever known the kind of quiet strength that changes the course of your days, you'll understand why I tell this story. And if you have someone like that in your life, take a moment to let them know.